welcome to the 7th of our Rights Talk, where we discuss with prominent human rights defenders the current human rights issues in Europe and beyond. Today's guest is Mr. Manuel Soares, the president of the Association of Portuguese Judges. And he's an ardent defender of human rights, and we'll be discussing with him the latest human rights issues in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Mr. Soares, welcome to Rights Talk. And perhaps I should start by asking you, perhaps could you tell us a bit about yourself and the work you do in terms of defending and promoting human rights?
Thank you very much for the invitation. Good morning to you and also to the viewers. As you already said, I'm a judge. I'm also the president of the Judges Association in Portugal. I've always been a judge my whole life. I started in courts in 1992, and I've been a judge since then in several courts. I'm also now since 2018, the president of the Portuguese Judges Association. I also worked as a judge in a European Union mission, EULEX, in Kosovo between 2013 and 2015. And I would say that as a judge, in my cases, when I'm adjudicating the cases that I have in front of me, I must be a human rights defender as any other judge, because that's our job, that's the job of courts. Always look at the law in the perspective of how should the law improve rights especially of those persons whose rights are being violated either by the state or by any other parties. But outside this job of a judge that I have to perform as any other judge, I'm also involved in being the president of the Judges Association in other activities. And in fact, we are going to do a congress next March, and one of the issues that will be in the opening will be exactly about human rights, with several examples of what is happening in several countries in Europe, and try to raise public attention to this never-ending question. How can we, as countries, as people, be better on defending and promoting human rights?
Thank you. Perhaps, I mean, the recent developments have started to pose bigger questions in terms of human rights and how we go about defending human rights in Europe and maybe beyond. So one of the issues was, you know, all these authoritarian regimes, the Western governments, they were trying to appease to them, and we ended up, in terms of Russia, that, you know, we saw that this didn't work. The Polish Prime Minister, just after the invasion, he said, I'll quote, "We must stop, West must stop its policy of appeasement towards Vladimir Putin." So do you believe, though, I mean, personally, there can be mileage in appeasement in terms of convincing authoritarian leaders or regimes to stay within the law?
Look, this policy of dialogue and approximation, especially of the European Union with the dictator Putin, proved to be ineffective. We can see now this very clear. Maybe 2 years ago, we wouldn't realize it as clear as now, but now we can see it. It created economic dependency and allowed also Russia to strengthen itself to the point of being able to invade a neighboring country. And without any valuable results or any advantage in terms of respect of human rights in Russia. But let's just put Russia situation apart for a moment, because there is a war going on and it changes the whole perspective when we have a war. The question that we should put to ourselves is, how should democracies deal with dictatorships? This is the big question that many countries and institutions, especially international institutions, have to deal with. Ignoring is immoral. We cannot turn our backs to the suffering of human beings and just pretend that those countries and that those regimes do not exist and not doing anything to try to improve their situation. So ignoring is not an answer. Collaborating with them is also immoral. We cannot strengthen dictators' ability to oppress their own people and also to sometimes try to expand the way they view the world to other and try to corrode other democracies. Even if there is economic or geostrategical interest, it's immoral to collaborate and to accept dictatorships. And also, blocking economic development, is this effective? Well, we have the example of North Korea. We have the example of Venezuela. There is a big blockage of economic relations with those countries for many years, and it seems that it didn't help. They are still dictatorships, probably even worse than they were in the beginning. Maybe this even strengthened the rhetoric of the dictatorships, saying that they are being persecuted by everybody else, and so they need to defend themselves. Confronting dictatorships militarily is also not an option. We saw what happened in Afghanistan, in Iraq. There was an armed conflict there. And if we look back at it now, in human rights perspective, are there people better now than they were before the military issues? Well, I'm not sure. I don't think they are. So excluding all other options, I think dialogue with dictatorial regimes may be sometimes the only option, because we must bear in mind that dictatorships, they die from inside. Either they corrode themselves to the point of collapsing, or it's many times useless to try from the outside with rhetoric to turn a dictatorship down. It has shown in the past that it doesn't work that way. It's the people that overthrows their dictators. So sometimes a dialogue that is not of support or of cooperation, a dialogue that does not give up the idea of denouncing the violations of human rights and keeps the attention of the public on those issues, it might be, to be frank, the only solution that we have in many cases with powerful countries. Because let's be honest, what can one do against China? I mean, can we go there with an army and say, now, from now on, you have to respect human rights? Yeah. Does it work this way? It doesn't work that way.
Okay, so effectively, dialogue must continue, but the Western governments, they should be wary of not crossing the line and stepping into this territory of actually appeasing those regimes. Another issue that came up recently was, you mentioned China. Ms. Michelle Bachelet, and she, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, she's been to China, and when she was in China, after a few days, she started to repeat the Chinese rhetoric of de-radicalization when she was referring to the human rights violations targeting Uyghurs, and of course, she drew a lot of criticism from everyone, and she was accused of diminishing the credibility of her office. And just recently, I think a couple of days ago, she just said she's not going to be running for another term. I think good for everyone, and she's going to be retiring from her office. And the same thing happened a couple of years ago during the pandemic, when the president of the European Court of Human Rights, he paid a visit to Turkey, and he posed with President Erdogan himself, and went to accept an honorary PhD degree from a university, which had dismissed quite a number of its own academics for speaking up for peace. And then he went to, the president of the court went to southern Turkey and paid a visit to a mayorship, which was confiscated, shall we say, and in the pretext of fighting with terrorism. So, I mean, should we be worried that, you know, these international institutions, which are there to protect human rights, are not doing 100% of what they are supposed to be doing in defending and promoting human rights? Because there's a lot of reason for concern.
Well, we should be worried, of course, and we should criticize them publicly for what they did, because this is probably the way that may be able to make those institutions to change the way they modify the way they act. Look, international institutions cannot have double moral standards on democracy and human rights. This can simply not be done. I mean, an international institution that wishes to be respected and needs to be respected cannot have a different way of approaching this issue regarding a powerful country or a weakest country, because the principles are the same for everybody. Of course, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, I read her statement after the visit. She said that she was raising attention also to the improvements on education, on gender equality, on the rule of law. But she also mentioned the situation of the Uyghurs and also other situations that in China are still very problematic in terms of human rights respect. But I think she was not clear enough. And this is, unfortunately, and the history shows it, how UN deals with these issues. It's also always this diplomatic approach of having these very round and generic concepts and approaches, like the diplomats like to talk, and sometimes it makes you lose perspective of what is happening. And of course, this diminishes the United Nations ability to be heard and respected. So I think this was not a good move, of course. And in the case of the president of the European Court of Human Rights that I discussed with colleagues, I think it is simply unacceptable what he did. I think he should have resigned. And if he didn't, as he didn't, his colleagues in the court should have asked him to resign and make a public statement that they did not agree what he did. Because it's completely unacceptable for the president of a court that has to deal with difficult complaints against Turkey from people that is being persecuted by Turkish authorities. How can a president of the court that needs to be independent and impartial accept going to Turkey, to a university that threw away professors just because they had different opinions for political reasons, and to support, because that's what he did, he went there to support the Turkish government, because that's the reading that you have from the outside. And even if it wasn't his first intention, the result was this. He was there supporting the Turkish authorities. And then if we think that sometime later, the European Court of Human Rights had some decisions regarding the Turkish situation that were not completely accepted, because some of them raised some doubts on how European Court of Human Rights can really deal with these situations. Of course, even the judges that had rendered these decisions, they I hope and I trust they were impartial, but from the outside, a normal citizen can look at the court and raise doubts on the impartiality of the court because its president was involved in a situation that he should have never been involved. So I think these attitudes are deplorable, and the way that human rights organizations should deal with this is to make public their disagreement and accusing these institutions and these persons of misconduct on their jobs, because this is the way that in the future these institutions might refrain from themselves from repeating these kind of actions.
Thank you. And finally, I mean, as human rights defenders everywhere, everybody's, I think, reassessing their position nowadays, because now we live in a different world, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, even yesterday, Boris Johnson was talking about removing the UK from the European Convention of Human Rights. So, I mean, I could say these are pretty crazy times when it comes to human rights issues. And as a seasoned human rights defender yourself, how do you see it, and what sort of advice would you extend to human rights defenders all across Europe and maybe beyond, when it comes to adjusting to this new reality of actually trying to promote human rights when the world seems to moving further and further away from actually protecting human rights?
Look, it's clear that the 21st century began with a serious backsliding in democracy ideas in many countries. In Europe, we have now authoritarian regimes in Europe. We have other democracies that have an authoritarian speech, like you just mentioned, Boris Johnson. He lives in a democracy, but he doesn't sound like a Democrat. So there is a big backsliding on the democratic ideas because we can see that extremism and populism is advancing further and further. And this reality is in front of us. It's like a virus because we see it's spreading, and it's spreading fast. And I think we cannot stop it with just rhetoric. We could say that we are trying to put up a fire by throwing water on the wrong place. The way that we are used to deal with this issue is not effective anymore. We must change our approach. It's useless to just call authoritarian regimes fascists and dictators. Of course they are that, and they know that. But in many cases, they were elected by their own people. So just calling a fascist to a dictator, you're calling fascists to the persons that elected them. And this many times just strengthens their position. What democracies have to do, and also human rights organizations, is to clearly identify the causes that are behind this backsliding and give answers to those problems, those real problems that make people vote on dictators. Because you can not just look at the dictators, you must look at who is supporting them. What are the real problems that these persons are feeling, that democracies are not giving an answer to, and need to be addressed in a proper manner? Because there is also always a way of dealing with issues that are serious and concerns the populations, and not doing it without respecting human rights and respecting our values. So I think we must change our focus. Instead of just denouncing and calling dictators fascists, because sometimes we are just strengthening them, we should really look at how is it possible that now, with this much better stage in education and information, how is it possible that educated persons and peoples can elect democratically rulers that are dictators? And finding these causes will probably help us on addressing them and trying to avoid, because I look, are we better in terms of corruption because we are democracies? Well, we see that many democracies still have corruption. Did we do the necessary reforms to improve the way people live in many countries, or to make to close the gap between those many that are very rich and those that are very poor? Well, in many cases, democracies were not an answer for this. Is people better in terms of how they live? Well, in some countries, they are not. So if you don't deal with these issues, you will always have someone using these reasons to tell to the people, look, democracy is not working. We need more authority. The world is insecure. I will give you security, and I will also give you more economic well-being. And so in the end, I think that our job, your job, is not only to raise public attention, to point the finger, say those are dictators, is also doing something that is more difficult. It will probably take longer, but in the long term will be more effective. Why is this happening? And try to combat it before it's too late.